Hey guys, today we begin with stories where ordinary people swear they saw creatures from legends: fire-breathing dragons, giant lake serpents, and birds so big they darkened the sky. You'll hear how simple footprints, strange lights, and washed-up bones turned calm villages and far-flung seas into the birthplaces of myth. By the end, you'll see how 40 real-world encounters kept these legends alive through the ages. But before you get comfortable, please make sure to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely appreciate the work I do here. And please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, put your phone or television remote out of reach, and let's move into tonight's journey together. In the hushed hours before dawn, when mist clings to the reedy shallows of an ancient lake, we find ourselves transported to the forgotten marshlands outside Silene, a small city that once flourished on the North African coast of what we now call Libya. Picture, if you will, the nervous villagers gathering at the water's edge as the first pale light touches the surface, their faces drawn with the weight of a terrible ritual that had become as regular as the rising sun. For generations, the people of Silene had lived in the shadow of something vast and hungry that dwelt beneath the dark waters. They called it a dragon, though the word meant something different then, not the winged, fire-breathing beasts of later fantasy, but a serpentine terror that could snatch a person from the shoreline and drag them into the murky depths. To keep this creature sated, to prevent it from emerging to devastate their crops and homes, the townspeople had developed a grim lottery. Each day, they would offer up a sheep or goat, and when livestock grew scarce, they would cast lots to determine which family would surrender their child to the lake's hungry guardian. The earliest written accounts of this tale emerge from the misty borderlands between history and legend. A text attributed to Pseudo-Callisthenes, writing sometime in the 3rd century, mentions a great serpent dwelling in North African waters. Centuries later, Jacobus de Voragine would weave these threads into his golden legend, transforming scattered reports of crocodile encounters into the heroic narrative we recognize today. But beneath the medieval embellishments lies something intriguingly specific: detailed descriptions of a creature's behavior that align remarkably well with the hunting patterns of real predators. What might the villagers of Silene actually have encountered in those reedy shallows? Climate researchers suggest that during the Roman period, North Africa experienced dramatic environmental shifts. As the Sahara expanded and water sources dwindled, large Nile crocodiles may have been pushed northward into coastal regions where they had never been seen before. To people unfamiliar with such massive reptiles, a 20-foot crocodile surfacing in their previously safe lake would indeed seem like a monster from the underworld. Other possibilities whisper through the archaeological record: oversized monitor lizards, whose swimming forms could easily be mistaken for serpents, or perhaps the misidentified bones of ancient marine reptiles, weathered from nearby cliffs and assembled by frightened minds into the skeleton of something terrible. The power of St. George's eventual triumph over this creature resonated far beyond one small African town. Medieval pilgrims carried the story along the trade routes that connected Europe to the Holy Land, and in each retelling, the tale grew richer with symbolic meaning. Here was pure good confronting primordial chaos, civilization taming the wild unknown, faith conquering fear. The dragon became everything dark and uncertain that lurked at the edges of human understanding. And so, as our story settles into the peaceful rhythm of memory, imagine that ancient lake one final time. The terrible creature gone, the water's surface smooth as black glass beneath a canopy of stars, reflecting the eternal dance of constellations while gentle waves lap against the shore in a rhythm as old as time itself. Picture Pliny the Elder, that meticulous Roman collector of oddities, sitting in his villa around 77 AD, stylus poised over wax tablets. When he writes about the basilisk, he's almost dismissively brief. Born from a serpent's egg, incubated by a cockerel, he notes, as if documenting the price of grain. Its gaze kills instantly. No flowery language, no dramatic flourishes, just the cold efficiency of a man who's catalogued everything from talking dolphins to trees that weep blood. But here's what's deliciously ironic. Pliny's dry, almost bored tone would later inspire centuries of increasingly hysterical medieval accounts. Those scribes couldn't leave well enough alone, could they? They transformed his matter-of-fact monster into something that could crack stones with a glance and wither entire forests with its breath. The real story, though, begins in Alexandria's bustling harbours, where Egyptian merchants packed spitting cobras into sealed amphorae like venomous wine. These weren't exotic pets, they were ingredients for medicines, poisons, and the kind of practical magic that kept the Roman Empire's darker industries humming along. Sailors loading these ceramic time bombs onto grain ships had plenty of time during those long Mediterranean crossings to embellish the truth. Picture them huddled around braziers on deck, voices dropping to whispers as they spun tales of cargo holds that reeked of death, of serpents whose eyes glowed like coals in the darkness. One sailor swears he saw a cobra rear up and kill a dock worker with nothing but its stare. Another claims the amphorae themselves grew warm to the touch, as if the snakes inside were breathing fire. By the time these stories reached Roman dinner parties, the humble spitting cobra had evolved into something far more sinister. The alchemists of Alexandria, those obsessive tinkerers with mercury and sulfur, found the basilisk concept absolutely fascinating. They were convinced that venom and vision were somehow connected, that the same force which made a snake's bite deadly could be concentrated in its gaze. Think about it from their perspective. If you could distill pure malice into liquid form, wouldn't it make sense that the same creature could project that essence through its eyes? The royal connection wasn't lost on them either. Basiliskos literally means little king, and Egyptian pharaohs had been putting cobras on their crowns for millennia. Perhaps, the alchemists theorized, the basilisk wasn't just a monster, it was a living symbol of absolute power, the kind that kills with a look. Deep in the library of Alexandria's quieter alcoves, long after the evening's scholarly debates had ended, scribes worked by flickering torchlight, copying endless variations of serpent lore onto fresh parchment. Their reed pens scratched softly against papyrus as they transcribed sailors' tales, merchants' warnings, and philosophers' theories about creatures that may or may not have existed. In the amber glow of oil lamps, surrounded by the musty smell of ancient scrolls, they were unknowingly preserving humanity's first attempts to explain the inexplicable transforming fear into literature, one careful letter at a time. Picture, if you will, the ancient Silk Road at dawn. Mist clings to endless grasslands where caravans once paused between the known world and the mysterious East. Here, where reality blurred into legend with each mile traveled, merchants whispered of creatures that seemed too wondrous to exist. Among these tales, none captured imaginations quite like stories of the unicorn beast, both sacred and elusive, carrying secrets in its single, spiraling horn. The Greeks knew it first through Ctesias, court physician to Persian kings, who described a wild ass of India bearing one horn upon its forehead, white as fresh snow, red at the tip, black in the middle. His writings spoke of a creature fleet as wind, impossible to capture alive, whose horn held powers against poison and disease. Persian manuscripts echoed these accounts, their illuminated pages showing elegant beasts grazing in paradisiacal gardens. Meanwhile, Chinese chronicles told of the Qilin, a chimeric being with deer-like grace and a single horn, appearing only when wise rulers governed justly. These weren't mere fairy tales to ancient minds, they were natural history, recorded by learned men who trusted their sources as we might trust a documentary today. But what were these travelers actually seeing? The truth, as often happens, proves more fascinating than fiction. Indian rhinoceroses, viewed from a distance or described secondhand, could easily become unicorns in retelling. Their single horn, thick and formidable, matched descriptions perfectly when filtered through languages and centuries. Arabian oryx, graceful antelopes whose twin horns appear as one magnificent spear when glimpsed in profile, likely inspired Persian accounts. Most intriguingly, narwhal tusks, those extraordinary spiraled ivory spears from Arctic seas, found their way south through Viking trade routes, sold as alicorn to buyers who'd never seen their oceanic origins. Medieval bestiaries depicted unicorns with distinctly narwhal-like horns, suggesting these whale teeth shaped European unicorn imagery for generations. Court apothecaries across Asia and Europe prized these supposed unicorn horns above rubies. They'd scrape precious shavings into tonics and powders, convinced of their ability to neutralize poisons and cure ailments. Chinese emperors kept carved cups of unicorn horn, believing liquid drunk from them would reveal any toxin. European nobles paid fortunes for alicorn fragments, while Arabian physicians prescribed unicorn horn powder for everything from fever to melancholy. The demand was so fierce that rhinoceros horn, narwhal tusk, and even carved bone substitutes flooded medieval markets, each fragment carrying dreams of purity and healing. As night settles over our imagined steppe, envision a lone rhinoceros moving through moon-washed reeds, its ancient bulk casting shadows that dance like legends themselves. Water ripples at its feet while mist rises around its single hornot. Magical, perhaps, but magnificent nonetheless. In this quiet moment, we glimpse what those long-ago travelers might have seen, not a mythical beast, but something equally wondrous wild nature itself, mysterious and beautiful enough to birth 1,000 tales. Picture this. You're a Bronze Age shepherd, scrambling through limestone caves on Crete, torch flickering against ancient walls. Your foot catches something smooth, enormous. You bend down, brush away centuries of dust, and there it is, a skull the size of a wine amphora, with a single gaping socket right in the center. No wonder the old stories spoke of one-eyed giants. These weren't mythical creatures at all, of course. What those ancient cave explorers had stumbled upon were the fossilized remains of dwarf elephants, specifically their skulls. The central nasal cavity where the trunk once attached created that unmistakable cyclops appearance. Sicily and Crete were absolutely littered with these things, tucked away in coastal caves and mountain grottos like nature's own museum of monsters. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for mythology making. As Mediterranean trade routes flourished, sailors carried these bone-deep stories from island to island. Homer's Odyssey wasn't just epic poetry, it was the ancient world's equivalent of a campfire ghost story, passed down through generations of seafarers who'd seen things that defied explanation. Polyphemus, that famous one-eyed giant trapped in his cave by clever Odysseus, suddenly makes a lot more sense when you consider that Greek sailors were literally finding cyclops skulls in caves across the Aegean. But here's where it gets beautifully human. The stories didn't stay frozen in epic verse. They evolved, adapted, became part of everyday life. Shepherds grazing their flocks in the Rocky Highlands began weaving tales of massive, one-eyed guardians who watched over mountain pastures. These weren't the rage-filled monsters of Homer's imagination, but something more protective, more melancholy. Giants who'd once walked these same hills, leaving only their bones behind as proof of a world that was larger, stranger, more wonderful than the one humans inherited. Local folklore painted them as solitary beings, neither fully good nor evil, just immense and alone. They'd appear in stories told during long nights of seasonal grazing, when shepherds needed something to explain the odd-shaped boulders, the two perfect stone circles, the way sound echoed strangely through certain valleys. Every unexplained geological feature became potential evidence of Cyclops activity, every unusual rock formation another chapter in an ongoing mystery. The transition from fossil discovery to living mythology shows just how desperately humans need their world to make sense. We're pattern-seeking creatures, and when we find a skull with a single eye socket, well, that's not just bone and calcium carbonate. That's proof that giants once walked among us, that the world was once bigger, more magical, more dangerous than our small lives suggest. And so tonight, as embers dim in countless hearths across the Mediterranean, imagine a shepherd's fire casting shadows against the cave wall behind him. There, barely visible in the dancing light, rests a mammoth skull-silent witness to stories that refuse to die, patient guardian of mysteries we're still trying to solve. Picture this. It's 1539, and Swedish ecclesiastic Olaus Magnus is hunched over his desk in Rome, quill scratching across parchment as he creates what will become the most wonderfully terrifying map of the North. His Carta Marinaliterae sea chart sprawls across 9 wooden blocks, depicting Scandinavia in exquisite detail. But it's not the fjords or coastal towns that catch your eye. No, it's the absolute menagerie of sea monsters he's casually dropped into the Norwegian waters like maritime confetti. There, off the coast of Norway, Magnus sketches a creature so impossibly vast it could be mistaken for a small island. Multiple ships flee in terror, while this leviathan part octopus, part whale, part fever, emerges from depths that cartographers could only guess at. Magnus wasn't just making things up for dramatic effect, mind you. He was documenting what every sailor, fisherman, and coastal dweller simply knew to be true. Something enormous lurked beneath those dark northern waters. Fast forward to the bustling cod fisheries of the 16th century. Norwegian fishermen, hardy souls who'd spent their entire lives reading the moods of the sea, began reporting the strangest phenomenon. They'd spot what appeared to be a small, rocky island, perhaps a convenient place to rest or shelter from a sudden squall. But as they approached, the island would begin to move, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, until it vanished entirely beneath the waves, leaving only churning water and very confused fishermen. These weren't isolated incidents, or the ravings of men too long at sea. Entire fishing fleets reported the same experience, solid land that simply wasn't. The descriptions were remarkably consistent: dark, rough-textured surfaces that rose and fell with an almost breathing rhythm. Some claimed to see massive tentacles thick as ship masts disappearing into the depths. Others spoke of eyes the size of dinner plates, watching them from just beneath the surface before the whole mass sank away. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere between myth and reality. What these fishermen were witnessing were likely encounters with Architeuthis, the giant squid. These remarkable creatures, which can grow to lengths of 40 feet or more, occasionally surface when dying or distressed. Their massive, gelatinous bodies could indeed resemble floating islands, especially in the dim light of northern waters. But here's where things get deliciously complicated. Giant squid carcasses that wash ashore carry with them an overwhelming scent of ammonia. This chemical signature, so potent it can be detected from considerable distances, transformed every beach specimen into something far more monstrous in the telling. Fishermen would discover these massive, alien forms on remote beaches, the ammonia scent burning their nostrils and adding an otherworldly quality to an already extraordinary find. As our tale settles into the gentle rhythm of lapping waves, imagine standing on a Norwegian fjord at twilight. The water lies glass smooth, reflecting the last purple light of day. Somewhere in the distance, a foghorn calls across the waterlow, mournful, ancient. Perhaps it's just a ship finding its way home. Or perhaps, in these waters where myth and reality have danced together for centuries, it's something else entirely, singing its own deep song to the darkening sky. January 1909 brought an unusual hysteria to the sleepy townships of southern New Jersey. It began with a single newspaper report in Camden, then spread like wildfire through the Pine Barrens region. The Philadelphia Evening Bulletin ran headlines about mysterious tracks discovered in fresh snow, strange cries echoing through winter nights, and livestock found mutilated at dawn. Within days, similar stories emerged from Collingswood, Haddon Heights, and a dozen other small communities. Schools shuttered their doors. Trolley conductors armed themselves with rifles and lanterns. Factory workers traveled in groups, unwilling to walk home alone after dark. The creature responsible, according to breathless accounts, stood 7 feet tall with leathery wings, glowing red eyes, and hooves that left distinctive marks in mud and snow. Local authorities found themselves overwhelmed by reports of sightings, property damage, and demands for protection from whatever stalked the winter darkness. But this panic had roots stretching back over 2 centuries. The creature terrorizing New Jersey in 1909 was no newcomer. Locals called it the Leeds Devil, named after a colonial family whose 13th child had supposedly been born cursed. According to Pine Barrens folklore, Mother Leeds had grown so weary of childbearing that she declared her next baby could belong to the devil himself. When the infant arrived in the 1730s, it allegedly transformed before her eyes into a monstrous creature that flew up the chimney and disappeared into the vast wilderness surrounding their remote cabin. The Pine Barrens provided perfect breeding ground for such legends. This million-acre expanse of dense forest, winding rivers, and isolated settlements had always harbored strange stories. Early European colonists found the landscape impenetrable and forbidding. Native Lenape tribes spoke of spirits dwelling in the deepest woods. Generations of hunters, loggers, and bog iron workers emerged from the pines with tales of unexplained sounds, mysterious lights, and glimpses of things that shouldn't exist. When investigators finally examined the physical evidence in 1909, prosaic explanations emerged. The distinctive hoofprints matched perfectly with tracks left by sandhill cranes, large migratory birds whose feet could appear cloven in soft snow. Fox trails, when partially melted and refrozen, created elongated impressions that suggested something far more sinister. Barn cats defending territory produced the haunting screams attributed to the devil's hunting calls. The panic subsided as quickly as it had begun. Newspapers moved on to other stories. Schools reopened. Trolley conductors set aside their weapons. But the Pine Barrens kept their secrets, as they always had. On quiet winter nights, when the wind moves through ancient cedar swamps and whispers across frozen bogs, you can almost understand how rational people might mistake the ordinary sounds of wilderness for something altogether more mysterious. The forest remembers every story ever told about it, and sometimes, in the right light and shadow, those stories feel more real than the mundane explanations that daylight brings. The wind never stops in Friesland. It cuts across the flat expanse of northern Netherlands, bending the grass and spinning the wooden arms of ancient windmills that dot the horizon like sleeping giants. But beneath this endless sky, in the dark peat bogs that have swallowed centuries of secrets, something extraordinary was waiting to be found. In the early 1600s, peat diggers worked these marshlands with calloused hands and aching backs, cutting through layers of compressed vegetation that had accumulated over millennia. The peat was their livelihood, dried and burned for fuel, sold to heat the homes of Amsterdam's growing merchant class. But on one particular morning, as the autumn mist clung to the water's surface, a digger's spade struck something harder than compressed moss and ancient leaves. What emerged from that black earth defied explanation. The skull was massive, easily the size of a horse's head, but with features that belonged to no earthly creature. A powerful beak curved downward like an eagle's, yet the bone structure suggested something far more formidable. Behind the eye sockets, which were large enough to cup a man's fist, ridges and crests formed patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if nature itself had been trying to craft something magnificent and terrible. Word spread quickly through the local villages, and soon more skulls were discovered. Each one bore the same impossible characteristics: part bird, part beast, all mystery. The peat diggers, simple folk who had spent their lives pulling fuel from the earth, now found themselves custodians of something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural world. The merchant guilds of Amsterdam took notice. These were practical men, traders who dealt in silk and spices, silver and grain. But they also understood the power of symbols, the way a compelling image could capture imagination and inspire confidence. The griffon, that legendary guardian of treasure, had long been associated with prosperity and protection. Here, seemingly, was proof that such creatures had once walked the earth. Guild craftsmen began incorporating griffon motifs into their trade crests and ceremonial objects. The creature's image appeared on everything from shipping manifests to guild hall tapestries. They spoke of ancient Scythian legends, tales of golden-beaked beasts that guarded vast hordes in distant lands. Perhaps, they reasoned, these Dutch specimens were cousins to those legendary guardians, brought north by migration or catastrophe. Today, these remarkable skulls rest in museum cases, where careful climate control preserves bone that has survived since the last ice age. The lighting is kept deliberately dim to prevent deterioration, casting everything in an eternal twilight. Visitors move through these halls with unconscious reverence, their footsteps echoing in the hush. The protoceratid skulls for that is what science eventually named. Them sit behind glass like sleeping dragons, their empty sockets still holding mysteries that bridge the gap between reality and legend. Picture Yorkshire in the winter of 1225. The moors stretch endlessly under pewter skies, punctuated only by dry stone walls and the occasional huddled farmstead. Wetherby Moor sits like a sleeping giant, its heather-covered slopes rolling toward the river wharf. On December evenings, when frost begins to silver the grass, Shepherds would drive their flocks down from the high pastures, eager to reach the warmth of their cottages before full darkness fell. But on one particular night, darkness brought something else entirely. The first accounts come from Brother Aldrich of Bardsey Abbey, whose careful Latin chronicles describe what the local farmers could only whisper about in trembling voices. A winged worm of terrible aspect had appeared over the moor, breathing fire that set the very stones ablaze. The creatures passing left trails of burning talus scattered across the hillsides, glowing fragments that hissed and steamed when touched by melting snow. Thomas the shepherd was tending his flock near Rudding when he saw it first, writhing serpent of light that undulated across the sky, its wings beating with the sound of rushing wind. His sheep scattered in panic, bleating frantically as they stumbled over the rough ground. The dragon swooped low, and where its breath touched the earth, fires sprang up among the gorse and bracken. Night after night, the beast returned. Farm wives barricaded their doors and crossed themselves when sunset approached. Children were kept indoors after dark. The dragon seemed particularly drawn to the sheepfolds, perhaps attracted by the warm bodies huddled within. Several farmers reported finding their stone walls cracked and scorched come morning, with strange metallic fragments embedded in the gaps between the stones. What Brother Aldrich was dutifully recording, of course, was likely the Beta Leonide meteor shower of December 1225, combined with the atmospheric phenomenon we now call ball lightning. To medieval eyes, unfamiliar with celestial mechanics, a shower of bright meteors streaking across the winter sky would indeed resemble a great winged serpent. The glowing talus was probably meteorite fragments, still hot from their atmospheric entry, scattered across the moor where they landed. Ball lightning, those mysterious, slowly moving orbs of electrical energy, would have completed the illusion perfectly, drifting low over the landscape like a dragon's fiery breath made manifest. But knowledge of atmospheric physics wouldn't reach Yorkshire for another 5 centuries. In 1225, there was only one reasonable response to a dragon: prayer, and lots of it. The abbot of Bardsey organised solemn processions across the moor, bearing the armbone of St. Oswald and a fragment of the true cross. Villagers followed with candles and holy water, chanting Latin hymns they didn't understand but trusted implicitly. The processions wound their way along the ancient sheep tracks, stopping at each reported sighting to bless the scorched earth. For 3 nights, the dragon's appearances grew weaker, its fires dimmer. Then came the rainer, steady December downpour that hissed against the last glowing embers scattered across Wetherby Moor. By morning, the fires were cold ash, and the winged terror had vanished as mysteriously as it had come. The moor settled back into winter silence, disturbed only by the wind through the heather and the distant bleating of finally peaceful sheep. Long before maps carved the Pacific Northwest into counties and claims, the Squilal people knew the cedar forests held more than timber. Their grandmothers spoke of the hairy, one-stall guardians who moved between the great trees like shadows given flesh. These weren't monsters from nightmares, but keepers of the forest's oldest secrets. The cedar knows, they'd whisper, and the cedar remembers. The Squilal called them the protectors of the deep woods, beings who understood which trees should fall and which should stand for another century. When a cedar grew sick, these gentle giants would tend it with hands large enough to cradle a sapling. When loggers came with their hungry saws, the forest itself seemed to shift and confuse, paths vanishing overnight like morning mist. These stories drifted through generations like wood smoke, half remembered and wholly believed, until 1924 brought its own strange chapter to the mountain's memory book. Fred Beck and his mining crew had spent weeks digging for gold in the canyon's stubborn earth, their cabin perched on a ridge like a wooden question mark against the wilderness. The work was hard, the yields disappointing, but the forest around them hummed with something older than profit. It began with stones on the roof, not thrown with malice, but dropped with the gentle persistence of rain. Pebbles at first, then river rocks, each one landing with a soft thud that spoke more of curiosity than threat. The miners would emerge each morning to find their camp rearranged, not destroyed, just tidied. Tools moved to different spots, as if someone had been examining human craftsmanship with genuine interest. Beck claimed he saw one standing at the forest's edge one evening, tall as the young firs, watching their campfire with eyes that reflected ember light, not menacing, just observing. Like a librarian studying a particularly interesting book, the creature, if creature, it was seemed more puzzled by the humans than frightened. When Beck raised his rifle, more from instinct than intention, the figure melted back into the tree line without haste or panic. The newspapers would later scream about monster attacks and desperate escapes, but Beck's quieter truth was simpler. They'd been guests in something's living room, and eventually they'd worn out their welcome. Come spring, the snow revealed its own mysteries. Bear tracks pressed deep in the softening earth would begin normally enough the familiar four-pad print of a black bear searching for early berries. But then, mid-stride, the tracks would change. The rear paws would lengthen, the spacing widen, until what had been walking on four legs was clearly walking on two. Local naturalists offered explanations about snowmelt and shadow play, how morning sun could transform ordinary impressions into extraordinary stories. The tracks would be there at dawn, clear as carved signatures, then fade as the day warmed and the snow surrendered its secrets back to the earth. Down by Wanapum Lake, where the river runs silver in early light, residents still find them, sometimes footprints pressed deep in the muddy banks. Larger than any boot, deeper than any bear paw, they appear after quiet nights when the mist hangs low and the water barely whispers. But the river is patient and hungry, and by noon the evidence has always returned to the current, leaving only stories and the ancient cedars knowing silence. The billabong sits like a dark mirror in the Australian bush, its surface barely disturbed by the evening breeze that rustles through the surrounding eucalyptus. This is country that has been watched over for thousands of years, where the Wiradjuri and Gunditj Mara people knew every rock, every bend in the water, every sound that belonged, and every sound that didn't. The elders spoke of creatures that lived in the deepest parts of these waterholes, beings with voices that rumbled like distant thunder, rising from the murky depths when the moon was dark. The bunyip, they called it, not quite animal, not quite spirit, but something that demanded respect from anyone foolish enough to venture too close to the water's edge after sunset. These weren't bedtime stories meant to frighten children, but warnings passed down through generations who had learned to read the signs. The sudden silence of frogs, the way the water seemed to move against the wind, the deep groaning that seemed to come from the earth itself. When the Wiradjuri described their encounters, they spoke of eyes that glowed beneath the surface, of a creature large enough to create waves without breaking through to air. The Gunditj Mara told similar tales from their country further south, describing something that could mimic human voices, calling out from the reeds to lure the unwary closer. Both groups knew the cardinal rule. When the billabong began to speak, you walked away. The European settlers who arrived in the 1800s dismissed these stories as primitive superstition, right up until they started having their own encounters. In 1847, a group of stockmen near the Murray River claimed to have found the skull of a bunyip, displaying it proudly in local townships as proof of their conquest over the Australian wilderness. Crowds gathered to examine the elongated cranium, the unusual bone structure that seemed to belong to no known animal. For weeks, it was the talk of every pub and gathering hall, validation that the strange sounds heard near waterholes had a perfectly rational explanation. The excitement lasted until a traveling naturalist examined the skull more closely and delivered his verdict. It belonged to a severely deformed calf, its bones warped by disease or injury into something that appeared far more mysterious than it actually was. The settlers' proof crumbled, but their encounters with strange phenomena near the billabongs continued. What they were likely witnessing, unknown to them, were the dancing flames of marsh gas, methane bubbling up from decomposing vegetation beneath the water, igniting in the night air to create ghostly lights that flickered and swayed above the surface. These will-o'-wisps startled many a night fisherman, appearing to move with purpose, sometimes seeming to follow observers along the water's edge before vanishing without explanation. As midnight approaches the billabong tonight, the cricket chorus gradually fades to silence, leaving only the gentle lap of water against the muddy banks. Moonlight spreads across the surface like spilled mercury, transforming the dark water into something almost ethereal, peaceful, and watchful. Long before Oklahoma wore its name like a crown, The Osage people knew the prairie sky held secrets that would make your grandmother cross herself twice. Their storytellers spoke of Wazahada thunderbirds, whose wings could crack the heavens wide open, whose talons gripped lightning like fishing line. But these weren't the only creatures dancing in that endless blue dome above the grasslands. The Osage elders would gather children close when storm clouds gathered, whispering about the ancient war that played out overhead. Thunderbirds, they said, battled the horned serpents massive, scaled things that writhed through cloud banks like eels through dark water. When thunder rolled across the prairie, that was the sound of cosmic wrestling, feathers and scales locked in eternal combat. The lightning? That was thunderbird talons raking serpent hide, or perhaps serpent horns gouging bird breast. These weren't bedtime stories to lull babies to sleep. The Osage tracked these battles like weather patterns, reading the sky for signs of which ancient force might be winning on any given day. Then came 1886, and suddenly the tombstone epitaph was running sketches that would make a paleontologist weep with joy or terror. A giant lizard-like bird had allegedly been shot down near the Arizona mining town, its wingspan stretching an impossible 36 feet from tip to tip. The newspaper sketch showed something that looked like a pterosaur had wandered out of the Jurassic and into a gunfight. Local cowboys claimed they'd pumped lead into this thing until it finally crashed into the desert like a feathered meteor. The creature, they swore, had a head like a crocodile welded onto a turkey vulture, with wings that could cast shadows across entire homesteads. Some folks said they'd posed for photographs next to the carcass, though those pictures seemed to vanish faster than morning dew. Word of the tombstone creature spread like wildfire through telegraph lines and train car conversations. Suddenly, every frontier newspaper was running stories about massive birds, winged serpents, and things that shouldn't exist outside of fever dreams. The dime novel writers seized on these tales like vultures on roadkill, spinning yarns about pterodactyl gunfights and cowboys lassoing flying reptiles. But here's where it gets interesting. Paleontologists were just starting to piece together pterosaur fossils in the 1880s. Suddenly, everyone had a scientific framework for understanding these impossible creatures. Maybe that thing over Tombstone wasn't mythology after all. Maybe the Osage thunderbirds weren't just stories. As evening settles over the Oklahoma plains now, you can still hear echoes of those ancient battles. Storm clouds gather like they always have, pregnant with electricity and possibility. Thunder rolls across the grassland, that same primordial drumbeat the Osage knew by heart. And if you listen carefully, as the distant rumble melts into the gentle purling of prairie creeks, you might wonder if those old stories were trying to tell us something we've forgotten how to hear. The sky remembers what we've chosen to forget. Picture this. It's the 4th of August, 1577, and you're huddled in Blytheburg Church as a thunderstorm rages outside. Lightning splits the Suffolk sky, thunder shakes the ancient stones, and suddenly chaos. Parishioners scream as something tears through the nave, leaving behind gouges in the church door that you can still touch today, nearly 4.5 centuries later. Those claw marks weren't made by any ordinary dog. They're deep, deliberate scratches that speak of something far more substantial than a frightened spaniel seeking shelter. The locals knew immediately what had visited them that storm-lashed Sunday morning. Black Shuck, the phantom hound of East Anglia, had come calling. Now, before you roll your eyes and mutter about medieval superstition, consider this. Black Shuck's stories didn't emerge from nothing. For generations, people across Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex reported encounters with a massive black dog, sometimes described as large as a calf, with eyes like burning coals or saucers of flame. Unlike other ghostly apparitions that flit about causing minor inconveniences, Black Shuck carried a specific and terrifying reputation. He was death's herald, appearing to those whose time was nearly up. But here's the fascinating thing about folklore. It often serves as psychological infrastructure. In a world where sudden death lurked around every corner, plague, accident, violence having a supernatural explanation provided a strange comfort. If you saw Black Shuck, at least you knew what was coming. There was something almost reassuring about having death announce itself rather than striking without warning. Of course, rational minds have offered perfectly sensible explanations over the centuries. Ball lightning. That mysterious electrical phenomenon could certainly account for the otherworldly glow and the structural damage to churches. Large mastiffs, or even wolves, still present in 16th century England, might appear demonic when glimpsed through storm-lashed windows. And wet stone surfaces can create remarkable optical illusions, transforming ordinary shadows into something far more sinister. The meteorological records from 1577 support the ball lightning theory beautifully. That particular storm was exceptionally violent, with multiple lightning strikes recorded across Suffolk. The electromagnetic conditions were perfect for creating those rare, glowing orbs that seemed to move with deliberate intelligence, passing through walls and leaving behind the kind of damage that would terrify anyone unfamiliar with atmospheric physics. Yet somehow, the rational explanations never quite satisfy completely. Perhaps because the story of Black Shuck touches something deeper than mere meteorology or misidentified animals. It speaks to our ancient relationship with the unknown, our need to personify the forces that lie beyond our control. Tonight, if you find yourself walking through the Suffolk countryside when the mist rises from the marshes and the wind carries whispers through the hedgerows, you might understand why Black Shuck legends persist. Not because giant phantom hounds actually prowl the night, but because some stories transcend their literal truth to become something more essential reminders that mystery still exists in our thoroughly catalogued world. The candle gutters gently in Blytheburg's nave, casting dancing shadows across those ancient claw marks, while outside, the eternal Suffolk wind continues its restless song. In the sun-baked valleys of Provence, where lavender fields stretch toward ancient stone bridges, there lived a creature so terrible that even the Romans whispered its name with trembling lips. The Tarasque. Half dragon, half turtle, with 6 stumpy legs and a tail that could shatter cathedral walls. Its shell gleamed like burnished bronze, and from its leonine head came roars that sent entire villages fleeing toward the hills. For decades, this armored nightmare terrorized the banks of the Rhône. Merchants refused to travel the river roads. Fishermen abandoned their nets. Children were called inside before sunset, mothers crossing themselves as they barred their doors. The beast would emerge from the murky depths at twilight, its massive form creating waves that flooded the countryside. Livestock vanished. Bridges crumbled. The very stones seemed to weep. Then came Martha. Not a warrior maiden in gleaming mail, but a simple woman who had once walked beside Christ himself. She arrived in Tarascon carrying nothing but a wooden cross and an unshakable faith. While the townspeople cowered behind shuttered windows, Martha walked calmly to the riverbank and began to sing. Soft hymns drifted across the water like morning mist. The Tarasque rose from the depths, water cascading from its terrible shell, but instead of unleashing destruction, it simply listened. Martha's voice seemed to weave invisible threads around the creature's ancient heart. She approached slowly, fearlessly, and placed her hand upon its massive head. The beast that had terrorized Provence for generations became as docile as a lamb. Martha led it through the streets, where amazed citizens emerged to witness this impossible sight. Today, centuries later, the people of Tarascon remember. Every summer, their festival brings the Tarasque back to life through an enormous puppet that requires dozens of hands to operate. The replica beast, covered in silken scales and painted spines, dances through narrow medieval streets while children shriek with delighted terror. Drums echo off stone walls as the procession winds toward the river. Inside the Église Sainte-Marthe, suspended from the vaulted ceiling, hangs a massive crocodile skull. Whether it truly belonged to Martha's beast, no one can say. But pilgrims still come to touch the ancient bone, feeling the rough texture of something that might have once terrorized the Rhône. As evening falls over Tarascon, lantern-lit boats drift down the dark water. Their golden reflections dance like scales beneath the surface, and for just a moment, you might imagine you see something vast and patient moving in the depths below. The drums fade to whispers. The crowd disperses, but the Tarasque lives on, transformed from terror into tradition, from monster into memory. Along the muddy banks of the Yellow River, where centuries of silt have painted the landscape in shades of amber and rust, Ancient stories speak of serpent kings who commanded the very clouds themselves. These weren't mere legends whispered around cooking fires, they were detailed accounts of massive, undulating forms that emerged from the river's depths during the great floods, their scales catching what little sunlight penetrated the storm-darkened skies. The chroniclers wrote of creatures so vast their coils could dam entire tributaries, beings whose breath became the mist that rolled across the flooded plains each morning. In the 1920s, erosion from particularly heavy rains began exposing something extraordinary within the lowest cliffs that line this ancient waterway. Local villagers, digging new terraces for their crops, unearthed bones of impossible length vertebrae strung together like prayer beads, each one the size of a dinner plate. The fossils stretched through the yellow earth in graceful curves, suggesting creatures that had once moved with fluid, serpentine motion through primordial waters. What paleontologists would later identify as aquatic dinosaurs, the villagers immediately recognized as the earthly remains of their ancestral dragon kings. The connection felt natural, almost inevitable. These weren't random bones scattered by geological chance, they were arranged as if the creatures had been swimming through the ancient mud, their movements preserved in stone for thousands of years. Village elders began incorporating the fossil sites into their rain-calling ceremonies, believing the bones held residual power to influence the weather patterns that had always governed their survival. Imperial artisans, hearing these stories, began weaving dragon motifs into silk banners with unprecedented detail. Unlike the stylized dragons of earlier dynasties, these new designs captured something more anatomically precise. The elongated skulls, the fin-like appendages, the way light might play across wet scales. When hung in temple courtyards during drought seasons, these banners seemed to possess an almost hypnotic quality. Visitors reported feeling deeply calm while viewing them, as if the silk itself carried the rhythm of gentle rainfall. The ceremonies themselves became exercises in collective tranquility. Participants would gather at dawn, moving slowly around the fossil sites while the silk dragons fluttered overhead. There was no frantic dancing or desperate pleading, just a quiet acknowledgement of the ancient forces that connected sky to earth, past to present. The rhythm of the ritual matched the breathing of sleeping children, steady and unhurried. And perhaps there was something to it all. Contemporary accounts describe how, following these ceremonies, rain would often arrive not as violent downpours but as gentle, sustained showers, the kind that soaked deep into the earth without causing erosion. The sound of water on rice paddies became a lullaby that carried across entire valleys, droplets striking the broad leaves in patterns that seemed almost musical. Even today, local farmers report that the soil around the fossil sites retains moisture longer than elsewhere, as if those ancient bones still influence the water table flowing beneath their feet. In the crystalline waters off the Bahamas, where the Caribbean shelf drops away into an abyss, so perfectly circular it seems carved by some ancient god's compass, lies Dean's Blue Hole. At 663 feet deep, it's the world's second deepest marine sinkhole, a sapphire portal that has drawn divers since the 1970s like moths to an underwater flame. But those early explorers, tanks strapped to their backs and wonder in their hearts, brought back stories that had nothing to do with depth records or geological marvels. They spoke of the Lusca. Picture, if you will, those pioneering divers of the disco era, their primitive gear a far cry from today's sophisticated apparatus. Down, they'd descend through layers of impossibly blue water, each foot deeper, taking them further from the sun-dappled surface. At around 100 feet, where the walls of the hole began their steep plunge into darkness, strange things began to happen. Currents would suddenly seize them, not the gentle drift of surface waters, but powerful, purposeful suction that seemed to emanate from the depths below. Equipment would be torn from their grasp, pulled downward by invisible tentacles of water. And in the peripheral darkness, where their weak lights barely penetrated, shapes moved. Massive, undulating forms that seemed too large and too coordinated to be mere fish. Tentacles, they swore, thick as tree trunks, reaching up from the abyss with deliberate, hunting motions. The Lusca, according to Bahamian folklore, was a giant octopus that made its home in blue holes, capable of changing color to match the surrounding water, nearly invisible until it struck. But the sea, as always, had more mundane explanations hiding beneath its mysteries. The blue hole's unique geology created the perfect conditions for confusion and terror. Karst limestone formations, carved by millennia of water action, channel tidal flows in unpredictable ways. As Caribbean tides surge through underwater caverns and tunnels, they create sudden vortices and powerful downdrafts that can indeed seize an unwary diver. What felt like tentacles grabbing was merely physics asserting its ancient authority. Those shadowy leviathans, Caribbean reef sharks, magnificent predators that often hunt in the deeper waters around blue holes. In the limited visibility and disorienting environment of the sinkhole, an 8-foot shark glimpsed at the edge of perception could easily become a 30-foot monster in the retelling. And the Lusca's voice? Underwater acoustics play curious tricks in the confined space of a blue hole. The deep, resonant calls of Nassau groupers, amplified and distorted by the limestone walls, become something altogether more ominous in the ears of nervous divers suspended in the blue void. Between tides, when the current's still and the water settles to a perfect sapphire lull, Dean's blue hole returns to its peaceful slumber, keeping its secrets in the depths where sunlight has never touched stone. Along the jagged coastline of Cape Breton Island, where Atlantic swells crash against ancient granite cliffs, the Mi'kmaq people have long spoken of creatures that blur the line between seal and wolf. In their stories passed down through countless winter nights, the great spirit Glooskap once commanded sea wolves with spines of ice and eyes like frozen stars. These phantom hunters, larger than any earthly wolf, would emerge from the depths during the harshest months, their backs bristling with crystalline ridges that caught moonlight like scattered diamonds. The tales tell of these magnificent beasts working in coordinated packs, surrounding mighty whales in the deep channels between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, their haunting calls echoing across miles of open water as they drove their massive prey toward waiting hunters on shore. The winter of 1810 brought unusual ice conditions to the Cabot Strait, trapping several whaling vessels near the Cape's treacherous waters. Captain Josiah Blackwood of the merchant ship Perseverance recorded in his weathered logbook a series of encounters that would puzzle him for years to come. Night after night, as his crew huddled around whale oil lanterns, otherworldly howls drifted across the frozen channels. These weren't the familiar calls of harbour seals or the distant bark of ship's dogs, but something altogether more unsettling. The sounds seemed to move with purpose, coordinated and intelligent, rising and falling in what Blackwood described as Congress most unnatural. His first mate, a Scotsman named McCrae, who'd sailed these waters for 2 decades, swore the calls came from wolves walking on water, their eyes glowing green in the ship's lantern light as they circled the vessel just beyond the reach of illumination. What these seasoned mariners were likely witnessing was a remarkable acoustic phenomenon unique to Cape Breton's winter geography. Grey seals, massive and barrel-shaped, gather in large numbers around the island's ice floes during pupping season. Their deep resonant barks carry extraordinary distances across still, cold air, especially when fog rolls in from the Grand Banks. Meanwhile, on the wooded shores mere hundreds of yards away, timber wolves move through the coastal forests, their own calls mixing and harmonizing with the seals' vocalizations. Sound travels differently over ice and water, bending and amplifying in ways that can make a dozen scattered animals seem like a coordinated pack of supernatural hunters. On clear nights when the aurora borealis painted the northern sky in pale curtains of green and blue, the mystery often resolved itself. The ethereal light would illuminate the ice floes dotted with resting seals, their whiskered faces and dark eyes reflecting the celestial glow. Along the shoreline, the silhouettes of actual wolves would appear, pausing in their hunt to lift their muzzles skyward. In these moments of clarity, with the northern lights casting everything in gentle luminescence, the fearsome sea wolves of legend revealed themselves as nothing more than nature's own choir, seals and wolves singing together across the boundary between land and sea, their voices weaving through the Arctic air like a lullaby for the frozen north. Picture, if you will, the year 1801, when Clemens Brentano sat by candlelight, crafting verses that would breathe life into an ancient whisper. His romantic poem told of Lorelei, the golden-haired maiden who perched upon her rocky throne above the Rhine, combing her hair while singing sailors to their doom. But Brentano wasn't inventing from nothing. He was giving form to something that had haunted these waters for centuries, a presence felt rather than seen, heard rather than understood. The poet's words wrapped themselves around local folklore like morning mist around the riverbank, transforming scattered tales into a legend that would outlive empires. The Rhine narrows dramatically near Sankt Gorhausen, where limestone cliffs rise like cathedral walls from the water's edge. Here, the river becomes a liquid serpent, coiling through passages carved by millennia of patient erosion. Ancient currents collide and spiral, creating whirlpools that can drag down even experienced bargemen. But it's the acoustics that truly bewitch. Sound bounces off the rock faces in peculiar ways, creating echoes that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. A shout becomes a chorus, a whistle transforms into an otherworldly melody. Even today, visitors standing on the viewing platform report hearing phantom voices rising from the water below, as if the stones themselves were singing lullabies to the passing barges. Captain Wilhelm Hoffmann kept meticulous logs during his 40 years navigating Rhine steamers, and his entries from the 1850s make for fascinating reading. Dense fog, visibility near zero, he wrote one October evening. Yet beneath the engine's rhythm, unmistakable humming, female voice, though no passengers aboard save merchants and their wives, all accounted for and silent. Other captains reported similar phenomena, inexplicable melodies drifting across the water during the witching hours between midnight and dawn, sounds that seemed to emanate from the Lorelei Rock itself. These weren't superstitious men, they were practical souls who understood river currents and weather patterns, yet they documented experiences that defied rational explanation. One particularly detailed account describes how the mysterious singing would intensify during certain atmospheric conditions, as if the very air was conspiring to carry ancient voices across the centuries. Tonight, the Rhine flows peacefully past the Lorelei Rock, its surface broken only by gentle ripples that catch fragments of moonlight like scattered silver coins. Modern barges rest at their moorings, their crews long since retired to warm cabins where electric lights banish the old shadows. The tourist boats have finished their final runs of the day, leaving the river to its own quiet contemplations. Yet something lingers in the darkness. Perhaps it's merely the eternal conversation between water and stone, or the way night wind whispers through the gorge. But locals will tell you, if you listen carefully during the darkest hours before dawn, you might still hear her, Lorelei, the Rhine maiden, singing her timeless song to the moon's reflection, combing her golden hair while the river carries her melody toward distant seas, just as it has for 1,000 years. Lieutenant Jack Morrison had flown mail routes across the southwest for 3 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed that scorching August afternoon in 1939. His single-engine Stinson was cutting through the shimmering air above Death Valley when the temperature gauge began climbing toward the red. Below, the salt flats stretched endlessly, a cracked white canvas painted with heat mirages that danced like liquid mercury. Morrison was scanning for a suitable emergency landing spot when something impossibly large passed between his aircraft and the sun. The shadow engulfed his cockpit completely, not the brief flicker of a cloud, but a sustained darkness that seemed to stretch across half the valley floor. He craned his neck upward, squinting through the canopy, and saw what he would later describe as a bird of impossible proportions. Its wingspan appeared to dwarf his own aircraft, each wing stroke deliberate and powerful, riding the thermals with an ancient grace. The creature, if creature it was, seemed to hang motionless for several heartbeats before banking eastward toward the jagged peaks of the Panamint Range. Morrison fumbled for his camera, but by the time he'd freed it from his flight bag, only empty sky remained. The shadow had vanished as suddenly as it appeared, leaving him alone with his overheating engine and a story no one would believe. What Morrison likely witnessed was a perfect storm of desert optics. California condors, though rare even then, still soared these thermals, their 9-foot wingspans magnified by the valley's legendary heat mirages. Temperature inversions in Death Valley can distort objects to twice their actual size, while the interplay of heated air masses creates phantom shapes that seem to float detached from their sources. Cloud shadows racing across the desert floor often appear solid and three-dimensional when viewed from above. Yet the Cahuilla people who called this desert home for millennia might have offered a different explanation. Their oral traditions spoke of Taquitsky guardians whose massive wings could eclipse the sun and whose presence signaled either great fortune or terrible change. These beings dwelt in the high places, watching over the delicate balance between earth and heaven, sometimes revealing themselves to those who traveled the ancient paths with respect. As Morrison's engine finally cooled and the afternoon heat began its retreat toward the western mountains, the desert resumed its eternal rhythm. Heat haze shimmered and subsided like departing spirits. Somewhere in the distance, a pack of coyotes lifted their voices in haunting chorus, their song echoing off canyon walls as old as memory itself. Picture yourself sailing off the jagged coastline of Galicia in northwestern Spain, where the Atlantic crashes against ancient granite cliffs with the persistence of a particularly stubborn relative at Christmas dinner. Medieval sailors knew these waters held secrets darker than a tax collector's heart, and none more terrifying than the Zirion, a horned sea-goat that supposedly lured ships to their doom with all the enthusiasm of a used car salesman. Now, before you start imagining some sort of aquatic satyr doing the backstroke, let me paint you the proper picture. The Zirion wasn't your garden variety sea monster. According to Galician folklore, this creature possessed the body of a goat but moved through water like it owned the place, sporting magnificent horns that gleamed even in moonlight. Sailors reported seeing it rise from the depths, usually during those perfectly calm nights when the sea looked like black glass, the kind of evening that makes you think everything's going to be absolutely fine right before everything decidedly isn't. The beast supposedly worked alongside something called the Mare Tenebrosum, which translates roughly to dark sea, but sounds far more ominous in Latin, as most things do. Together, these entities would create phantom lights on the water, dancing patterns that drew ships off course like moths to a particularly vindictive flame. Seasoned captains would cross themselves and mutter prayers when they spotted these eerie illuminations, knowing that following them meant sailing straight into rocky outcrops or simply vanishing into maritime legend. But here's where things get deliciously scientific, in that way that makes ancient mysteries both more and less magical simultaneously. What those medieval sailors were likely witnessing was bioluminescence, specifically massive blooms of dinoflagellates and other microscopic organisms that light up when disturbed. When whales surface in these phosphorescent waters, their massive forms create glowing outlines that could easily resemble supernatural creatures, especially when viewed by sleep-deprived sailors who'd been living on hardtack and questionable water for weeks. The timing fits perfectly too. Galician waters experience seasonal bioluminescent blooms, particularly during warmer months when nutrients from upwelling currents create ideal conditions for these microscopic light shows. A surfacing whale in such conditions would appear as a massive, glowing form with what might look like horns, particularly if it's a right whale with its distinctive callosities or bumpy growths on its head. The Galicians, being a practical people despite their rich folklore traditions, developed a rather elegant solution to this maritime predicament. Fishermen and sailors began carrying traditional bagpipers on longer voyages, and these musicians would play specific lullabies designed to calm both crew and sea. The haunting melodies of Galician gaitas, those distinctive bagpipes with their uniquely mournful tone, became associated with safe passage home. These musical traditions persist today, with coastal communities still gathering for evening concerts where bagpipers play those same ancient melodies that once guided terrified sailors past phantom lights and spectral sea-goats, proving that sometimes the best way to handle supernatural maritime encounters is simply to play them a nice tune. In the endless sweep of the Gobi Desert, where sand meets sky in a line so clean it might have been drawn with a ruler, the herders know things the rest of us have forgotten. They know which stars predict the morning wind, which shadows mean water, and which sounds in the night mean you should pull your camels closer and wait for dawn. And they know about the death worm. For generations, these weathered men who follow their herds across Mongolia's most unforgiving landscape have told the same story. When the summer storms build on the horizon, when the air grows thick and electric, something stirs beneath the dunes. They describe it as thick as a man's arm, red like dried blood, stretching 2 feet or more. No legs, no visible head or tail, just smooth flesh that pulses with its own terrible life. The herders say it surfaces before the rain comes, drawn by the static charge that makes their hair stand on end and their camels stamp nervously. They've seen it arch out of the sand like a crimson question mark, felt the air around it hum with electricity. Touch it, they warn, and you'll drop dead where you stand. Even looking too long brings fever dreams and a taste like copper pennies in your mouth. But here's where the story gets interesting, because scattered across this same desert, you'll find the shed skins of sand vipers, pale, translucent tubes left behind as snakes grow larger. In the right light, after a sandstorm has scrubbed them smooth, these skins look almost red, almost alive. And then there are the sand eels. Most people don't know they exist, these quick-moving creatures that burrow through loose desert sand like water. They're perfectly real, perfectly harmless, and when glimpsed for just a moment as they dart between dunes, they could easily be mistaken for something far more sinister. The pieces fit together so neatly you almost want to leave them scattered instead. In the 1920s and 30s, Soviet expeditions pushed deep into the Gobi, mapping territories that had never appeared on any official chart. These were practical men, geologists and cartographers armed with instruments and skepticism. They catalogued every species they found, recorded wind patterns and mineral deposits and the precise coordinates of water sources. What they didn't find was any trace of the death worm. Their reports, filed away in Moscow archives, describe a desert of stunning emptiness, miles upon miles where the only movement comes from shifting sand and the occasional hardy lizard. They noted the electrical storms that swept across the wasteland, the way static built up so thick it could knock a man down, but no mysterious creatures, no bodies, no evidence of anything that couldn't be explained by perfectly ordinary desert wildlife and the tricks that isolation plays on the human mind. Still, when night falls over the Gobi and the wind smooths the dunes back to perfect blankness, when the stars burn steady and cold overhead, you have to wonder what else might be moving out there in the dark, just beyond the reach of our maps and instruments and comfortable certainties. Picture yourself unrolling an ancient Edo period scroll, its silk edges yellowed like autumn leaves. There, painted in delicate brushstrokes, crouches a most peculiar creature. Not quite turtle, not quite child, the kappa stares back at you with knowing eyes. Its shell gleams wetly in the painted moonlight, and atop its head sits a shallow bowl, filled with the river water that grants it strength. These scrolls, tucked away in temple archives for centuries, tell of encounters along Japan's misty waterways, where reality and folklore dance together like shadows on moving water. The kappa's legend served a purpose far more practical than mere entertainment. In villages where children played too close to dangerous currents, parents would whisper warnings about the cucumber-loving water spirits. "Stay away from the deep pools," mothers would murmur, "or the kappa will pull you down to feast." These weren't just ghost stories, they were survival manuals wrapped in wonder. The kappa's supposed weakness for cucumbers became a teaching tool, showing children how to appease dangerous waters with offerings thrown safely from the bank. Every drowned child became proof of the kappa's hunger. Every survivor evidence of proper respect paid to the river spirits. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of kappa lore lies in its connection to very real creatures lurking in Japan's mountain streams. Giant salamanders, massive amphibians that can grow longer than a grown man's arm, inhabit these same waters the kappa supposedly calls home. These ancient creatures, virtually unchanged for millions of years, move with an otherworldly grace through underwater caves and rocky crevices. Their skin feels slimy and cold to the touch, much like the kappa of legend. In the dim light filtering through forest canopies, a glimpse of a giant salamander's broad head breaking the surface might easily transform into something far more mystical in a frightened observer's memory. As evening settles over the rice paddies, fireflies begin their nightly dance above the irrigation canals. Their gentle blinking creates patterns of light that seem almost like signals messages between unseen watchers in the bamboo groves. The air grows thick with humidity and the scent of wet earth. Frogs chorus from hidden pools, their voices layering into a symphony that speaks of water's ancient power. In this liminal space between day and night, between the seen and unseen, it becomes easier to understand how generations of farmers and fishermen might glimpse something moving beneath the surface and think not of salamanders or shifting logs, but of kapathos, timeless guardians of Japan's waterways, forever caught between mischief and protection, between the world we know and the deeper mysteries that flow just beneath the surface of our understanding. Iceland sits like a geological argument between fire and ice, where the Earth's crust thins to paper and ancient beliefs refuse to die. Here, in a country that gave us Björk and bankruptcy, something far older than either still shapes the landscape. The Huldufolk, the hidden people, aren't just folklore characters you'd find on a tourist postcard next to puffins and geysers. They're active participants in modern infrastructure planning. Picture this. It's 2013, and you're a road engineer tasked with building a new highway outside Reykjavik. Simple enough, except your route cuts straight through an elf hill. In most countries, this would warrant maybe a chuckle and a bulldozer. In Iceland, it triggers environmental impact assessments that would make a California developer weep. Road crews have diverted entire highways around these sacred stones, adding millions to construction costs and months to timelines. Workers report equipment mysteriously malfunctioning near certain rocks, tools disappearing, and an unsettling feeling of being watched from empty hillsides. The practical Icelanders don't necessarily believe in elves. Plank, they just respect the possibility enough to build around it. The volcanic activity doesn't help matters. Iceland's geography reads like a geological horror story. Active volcanoes, geothermal vents, and tectonic plates literally tearing the island apart at a rate of 2 centimeters per year. When the ground trembles beneath Reykjavik, when strange sounds echo from beneath the permafrost, locals don't immediately think seismic activity. They think of the hidden cities supposedly thriving in parallel to their own. These aren't your garden variety fairy tale elves, with pointy ears and workshop anxiety. Huldufolk are described as human-sized, living in communities that mirror Icelandic society but remain just out of phase with our reality. They farm, they build, they apparently have strong opinions about highway placement. The volcanic rumblings become the sound of their construction projects, the ground tremors evidence of their underground expansion. Then came 2013's environmental assessment, an official government document that acknowledged folklore concerns as legitimate factors in development planning, not as quaint cultural heritage, but as actual considerations affecting public safety and project viability. Because when your entire workforce refuses to operate machinery near certain locations, folklore becomes logistics. The bureaucracy of the supernatural, environmental impact statements filed in triplicate, accounting for both carbon emissions and potential elf displacement. Only in Iceland would you find such delicious administrative absurdity. Tonight, snowflakes settle on basalt cliffs with the hushed whisper of secrets being buried. The aurora borealis dances overhead like cosmic static, and somewhere beneath the permafrost, the hidden people continue their construction projects, building a parallel world that occasionally intersects with ours at the most inconvenient, bureaucratic moments. Picture this. You're flipping through the book of Job, probably wondering why this guy's having such a terrible time, when suddenly God starts bragging about his greatest hits in the animal kingdom. Behold now Behemoth, the text says, which I made with thee. He eateth grass as an ox. But then things get weird. This grass-eater apparently has bones like bronze bars, a tail that sways like a cedar tree, and the ability to drink up entire rivers without breaking a sweat. Scholars have been scratching their heads over this description for millennia, but if you've ever seen a hippo emerge from murky water, like some prehistoric nightmare, you'd probably connect the dots pretty quickly. See, back when Job was allegedly getting his divine lecture, the Jordan River system was absolutely crawling with hippos. These weren't your modern zoo hippos lounging around looking deceptively cute. These were wild Middle Eastern hippos, and they were genuinely terrifying. Roman naturalists described them as river horses, but that's like calling a tornado a spirited breeze. A full-grown male could weigh 4 tons and had jaws that could snap a crocodile in half. When they opened their mouths, you could literally see down their throats to what looked like the gates of hell. The Romans, being Romans, obviously thought, let's capture some of these death machines and make them fight gladiators. Emperor Augustus imported hippos from Egypt for his games, and the crowd went absolutely wild. Picture the Colosseum packed with 50,000 people, all watching in stunned silence, as handlers somehow managed to drag these aquatic behemoths into the arena. The hippos would charge with surprising speed, their massive jaws snapping at anything that moved, while the audience realized they were witnessing something that belonged in mythology, not reality. But here's the thing about hippos: they're surprisingly fragile for such seemingly indestructible creatures. They need specific river conditions, particular types of vegetation, and most importantly, they need to be left alone. As the Roman Empire expanded and trade routes multiplied, the Jordan River hippo population began to crash. By the time Emperor Hadrian was building walls, these creatures had vanished entirely from the Levant. The last confirmed sighting was around 100 CE, and just like that, 4-ton river monsters became nothing more than confusing passages in ancient texts. Within a few generations, nobody remembered what a Middle Eastern hippo actually looked like. The stories grew stranger in the telling. Suddenly behemoths were breathing fire. Their tails became enormous beyond belief, and their appetites grew to mythical proportions. Parents would tell their children about the great beasts that once ruled the marshlands, but without any living examples, these stories drifted into the realm of pure fantasy. And so, as dawn breaks over the Jordan River Delta, casting golden light across reeds that once echoed with territorial roars, you can almost imagine those massive forms slipping beneath the surface one last time. The water barely ripples, morning mist clings to the banks, and somewhere in the distance, a bird calls out across the empty marsh where giants once walked. The autumn of 1966 settled heavy over Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where the Silver Bridge stretched its aging steel across the Ohio River like a patient giant. Night shift workers knew these hours well, the way headlights carved tunnels through river fog, how the old bridge creaked its metallic lullabies under the weight of lake traffic. But something else was stirring in those crisp November evenings, something that would turn routine commutes into encounters whispered about for decades. It started with the Scarberry couples Roger and Linda, Steve and Mary driving the back roads near the old TNT plant on the 15th of November. Their Chevy's headlights swept across the abandoned World War II munitions facility when they saw it, a grey figure, massive and wrong, perched atop a storage igloo. 7 feet tall, they'd later tell Sheriff Johnson, with wings folded against its back like an enormous moth. But it was the eyes that haunted them, glowing red orbs that reflected their headlights like twin brake lights in the darkness. The creature followed their car, they claimed, keeping pace at 85 miles per hour without seeming to flap those impossible wings. It glided alongside them with supernatural grace until they reached the Point Pleasant city limits, where it simply vanished into the night air above the river. Word spread quickly through the small Ohio Valley community. More sightings followed in rapid succession. Construction workers glimpsed the winged figure near the bridge approaches, couples reported red eyes watching from tree lines, and children swore they heard massive wings beating overhead on moonless nights. Local newspaper reporter Mary Heyer documented over 100 separate encounters in 13 months, each witness describing the same unsettling details: the enormous wingspan, the glowing eyes, the complete silence of its flight. Skeptics offered rational explanations that made perfect sense in daylight. November marked peak migration season for sandhill cranes, large birds with 6-foot wingspans that often flew at night. Their eyes contained a reflective membrane that could glow brilliant red when caught in car headlights or flashlight beams. The abandoned TNT plant provided ideal roosting habitat, and the Ohio River Valley served as a natural migration corridor. Simple misidentification, they argued, amplified by small-town gossip and pre-Christmas darkness. But explanations felt thin on the 15th of December, 1967. At 4:58 p.m., during evening rush hour, the Silver Bridge simply gave way. 46 people died as cars and steel plunged into the winter-cold Ohio River. The tragedy shocked the nation and forever changed Point Pleasant, but it also cemented the Mothman legend in ways nobody could have predicted. Some claimed the creature had been a harbinger, warning of impending disaster through its repeated appearances near the doomed bridge. Others suggested the supernatural attention had somehow caused the collapse itself, that otherworldly forces had focused too intently on their quiet river town. Most simply mourned their dead and tried to rebuild. Today, river mist still rises from the Monongahela each evening, muffling the sounds of modern traffic crossing the new bridge. Cicadas sing their low summer harmonies while night shift workers make their careful way home, headlights cutting familiar paths through the darkness, though some still glance upward, watching for red eyes in the sky. The summer of 1933 found Scotland caught between two worlds, the ancient and the modern. Motor cars puttered along newly paved roads that had once known only Highland ponies, while electric lights began to pierce the perpetual twilight of the glens. Yet nowhere was this collision of old and new more perfectly captured than on a quiet July afternoon beside the dark waters of Loch Ness. George Spicer and his wife were returning from their holiday, their modest automobile chugging contentedly along the A82 that hugged the loch's northern shore. The road was still something of a novelty completed just 2 years prior and afforded motorists their first clear, unobstructed views of waters that had remained largely hidden from casual travellers for centuries. It was Mrs. Spicer who first spotted the disturbance, a curious undulation breaking the mirror-smooth surface some 200 yards from shore. What they claimed to witness next would transform a quiet highland loch into the world's most famous monster habitat. According to Spicer's breathless account, an enormous creature easily 25 feet in length emerged from the water and crossed the road ahead of them before disappearing into the bracken on the far side. Its body, he insisted, resembled nothing so much as a massive snake, though broader and more substantial, with what appeared to be a long, graceful neck that curved like a question mark against the grey Highland sky. The Daily Mail, ever alert to stories that might capture the public imagination, seized upon Spicer's account with characteristic enthusiasm. Within weeks, reporters had descended upon the tiny village of Drumnadrachit like migrating birds, interviewing locals, examining the alleged crossing point, and filing dispatches that would soon make Nessie a household name from London to Edinburgh and beyond. The newspaper offered rewards for photographs, hired watchers, and generally transformed the quiet loch into something resembling a carnival midway. But the Spicer sighting arrived at a particularly fortuitous moment in popular culture. Cinema audiences had recently been thrilled by Willis O'Brien's stop-motion dinosaurs in The Lost World, while King Kong was drawing crowds with its promise of prehistoric monsters surviving in hidden corners of the earth. The pleasier saw that long-necked marine reptile that had captured Victorian imaginations seemed perfectly suited to Britain's deepest freshwater loch. Here was a creature that looked precisely as one might expect a lake monster to appear, complete with the serpentine grace that had always lurked in Celtic water tales. Yet Loch Ness held more prosaic secrets than prehistoric survivors. The loch's peculiar thermoclines created satious-standing waves that could produce mysterious humps and undulations on an otherwise calm surface. Ancient Scots pines, waterlogged and buoyant, occasionally broke free from the loch's depths to drift like dark, serpentine shapes across the water. Red deer, surprisingly accomplished swimmers, often struck out for the loch's islands, their antlered heads bobbing above the surface in ways that might easily be mistaken for something far more exotic. As evening settles over the highlands, the loch lies glassy beneath gathering twilight, its surface broken only by the occasional rise of a trout or the wake of a passing fishing boat. Whatever swims in these dark waters, ancient or mundane, continues to keep its counsel, while tourists still pause along the A82, cameras ready, hoping to glimpse something wonderful moving beneath the black mirror of Scotland's most mysterious loch. Picture this. You're approaching the ancient city of Nineveh, dust swirling around your sandals as the Tigris River glints in the distance. But as you near the palace gates, something stops you dead in your tracks. Towering above you are creatures that shouldn't exist, massive winged bulls with human heads, their stone eyes seeming to follow your every movement. These are the Lamassu, and they've been standing guard here for over 2,500 years. The Assyrians didn't just plop these magnificent beasts at their doorways for decoration. Oh no, these were serious business protective spirits tasked with keeping evil at bay. Each Lamassu stood as a sentinel between the mortal world and the divine realm, their wings spread wide enough to cast shadows across entire courtyards. The craftsmen who carved them understood something we're only beginning to appreciate, that the boundary between our world and the mythical isn't a wall, but a doorway. What's fascinating is how these creatures bridge the gap between reality and legend. Walk through any Assyrian palace relief, and you'll see scenes of kings hunting lions, real lions, mind you, not mythical ones. But right alongside these earthly pursuits, you'll find the Lamassu, suggesting that for the Assyrians, the mythical and the mundane occupied the same space. A king might hunt actual lions in the morning and commune with winged bulls in the evening, and neither would seem more real than the other. The lion hunt reliefs tell their own story of this blurred boundary. Here's King Ashurbanipal, bow drawn, facing down a charging lion. The beast's muscles ripple with carved precision, every sinew captured in stone. But turn the corner, and there's a Lamassu, equally detailed, equally present. The message is clear. Both the lion and the guardian spirit inhabit the same reality. The ancient Assyrians lived in a world where myth wasn't separate from history, it was woven right into it. Modern archaeologists have been uncovering remarkable details about these guardians. Beneath layers of desert sand, they've found that the Lamassu weren't just carved stone, they had gypsum cores that would have gleamed white in the ancient sunlight. Traces of pigment suggest they were once painted in brilliant colors, deep blues, rich reds, glittering gold. Imagine encountering one of these creatures in their full glory, colors blazing against the limestone walls, wings seeming to flutter in the desert heat. The most haunting discoveries come from the hoofprints. Yes, hoofprints scarved into the stone platforms where the Lamassu stand. As if these creatures had been real, had landed on these very spots, had left their mark in the stone before taking their eternal positions as guardians. When the desert wind sweeps across these ancient thresholds today, clearing away millennia of accumulated sand, those hoofprints emerge once more, as fresh as if they were made yesterday. The Lamassu remind us that for our ancestors, the mythical wasn't myth at all, it was simply another part of reality, standing guard at the very gates of civilization. Deep in California's Trinity Alps, where the ancient redwoods stretch their cathedral arms toward a sky they've been reaching for since before humans learned to look up in wonder, the summer of 1890 brought more than just gold fever to the mountain valleys. It brought something that made grown men abandon their claims and walk 30 miles back to civilization, swearing off strong drink and promising their wives they'd take up safer work, like dynamite handling or bear wrestling. The prospectors came with names like Sutter and McKinnon and Old Dutch Willem, men whose hands knew the weight of a pickaxe and whose ears knew the difference between settling timber and something else entirely. They'd worked the Sierra Nevada, the Cascades, places where the wilderness could kill you in a dozen different ways before breakfast. But the Trinity Alps in 1890 offered them something new, the methodical, deliberate sound of something large systematically knocking on trees in patterns too regular for wind, too purposeful for any creature they'd catalogued in their mental bestiary of things that go bump in the California night. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. Always at dusk, when the light filtering through the canopy turned everything the color of old amber and shadows seemed to pool like spilled ink between the massive trunks. McKinnon wrote to his brother in Sacramento, "It follows us, Thomas, from camp to camp, always 3 knocks, like it's announcing itself, or asking permission, or maybe just letting us know we're being watched by something that has better manners than most Christians I've met." The Yurok people, who'd lived in these forests since the world was young and understood its languages better than any textbook, had a name for what the prospectors were hearing: Otyel, the tall shadow that walks between the worlds of seen and unseen. Their stories spoke of a creature neither fully animal nor spirit, something that existed in the spaces between certainty and mystery, as real as hunger and as elusive as morning mist. The Otyel was a keeper of boundaries, they said, a reminder that some places belonged to older rules than the ones written in mining claims and surveyors' maps. Modern naturalists might point to the black bears common in these mountains, creatures perfectly capable of producing rhythmic knocking sounds when marking territory or investigating hollow trees. Bears are intelligent, curious, and surprisingly methodical when they want to be. But here's the beautiful paradox of mystery. Even if every tree, knock in the Trinity Alps, could be explained by bear behavior, does that make the experience any less profound for the men who heard them? Does knowing the mechanics of wonder diminish its power to transform us? The coastal fog still rolls through these mountains, muffling sound and blurring the edges of what we think we know about the world. Picture this. You're a Victorian gentleman, fresh off a steamship in Yokohama, and someone hands you a small clay figure. It's ancient, thousands of years old, with enormous goggle-like eyes and what appears to be, well, what does appear to be a helmet of sorts. Your mind, steeped in the Industrial Revolution and stories of diving bells, immediately leaps to the most logical conclusion: spacesuits. Obviously, this is exactly what happened when Western archaeologists first encountered the D-G figurines of Japan's Mon period. These remarkable clay sculptures, dating back over 10,000 years, became the unexpected stars of ancient astronaut theories. The bulbous eyes, the elaborate headdresses, the seemingly mechanical details, surely these were depictions of visitors from beyond the stars, preserved in fired clay by our bewildered ancestors. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for such interpretations. Here were the Meiji-era Japanese, suddenly open to Western influence, watching as foreign scholars examined their most ancient artifacts through distinctly Victorian lenses. Steam-powered ships, diving equipment, the promise of flight technology was reshaping the world, so why not the past as well? But step deeper into the mists of Shinto tradition, and you'll find stories that seem to whisper validation for these wild theories. Ancient tales speak of sky visitors descending from the heavens, beings who taught the early Japanese the sacred art of rice cultivation. They came down like falling stars, these celestial teachers, sharing knowledge that would transform a hunter-gatherer society into an agricultural civilization. The stories blur the line between myth and memory in that particularly Japanese way. Were these visiting kami, divine spirits taking physical form? Were they ancestral memories of real encounters, filtered through generations of oral tradition until truth became indistinguishable from poetry? Or were they simply the natural human tendency to credit the gods with life's great innovations? Modern archaeology offers a more prosaic explanation, though no less fascinating in its way. The D-G figures were almost certainly fertility charms, ritual objects used in ceremonies celebrating life, birth, and the mysterious forces that govern both. The exaggerated features, those alien-like eyes, the swollen forms represent not spacemen but the eternal human preoccupation with creation and continuity. Yet the myths persist, soft as moth wings against window glass. Even today, in the glow of smartphone screens and the hum of Wi-Fi signals, people look at these ancient clay faces and see something otherworldly. Perhaps that's the real magic of the D-G, not that they prove ancient aliens, but that they prove our endless capacity for wonder. Imagine them now, these small ceramic guardians, sitting in their display cases as the museum lights dim for the night. Outside, the modern city hums with electric life, but in the darkness between heartbeats, you can almost hear the echo of Mon hearth fires crackling, the drone of ancient summer insects, and the whispered stories of visitors who fell from the sky like stars. In the depths of Norway's Hardanger Fjord, where granite walls plunge into black water and waterfalls thunder down from heights that make your neck ache just looking up, the trolls never really left. They just got quieter. The Vikings knew this. They sailed these waters with one eye on the horizon and another on the shadows that moved wrong among the peaks. Because here, in this cathedral of stone and mist, the boundary between myth and memory grows thin as morning fog. Thorstein Eriksson learned this the hard way sometime around 1180, if the sagas are to be believed. A trader by profession and a skeptic by nature, he'd anchored his Nor in a sheltered cove to wait out a storm when he heard singing echoing off the fjord walls. Not human singing, mind you. Something deeper, older, with harmonics that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Following the sound up a goat track that probably hadn't seen human feet in decades, Thorstein discovered a cave mouth carved with runes he couldn't read, and a voice that called his name in perfect Norse. She emerged from the darkness like a landslide given form. 9 feet tall, with skin like weathered granite and hair that flowed like silver waterfalls, she was beautiful in the way avalanches are beautiful, magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. The mountain troll spoke of loneliness that had lasted centuries, of watching human ships pass below like mayflies, brief and bright and gone. She offered Thorstein riches beyond imagining, a palace carved from living rock, and love that would last until the mountains wore away to sand. The catch, naturally, was that he could never leave, never see the sun again, never sail another fjord or trade in another market. Thorstein, practical man that he was, asked for time to consider. The troll bride agreed, but warned him that dawn would seal his fate either way. Choose her and live forever in the deep places of the earth. Choose the world above and forget this night ever happened. As morning approached, the fjord began speaking in avalanche tongues. Rockfalls boomed across the water like cannon fire, sending echoes racing between the granite walls. In the growing light, Thorstein saw silhouettes moving along the ridgelines, impossibly large figures that might have been tricks of perspective, or might have been something else entirely. The mountain itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for his answer. He chose the sun, chose his ship and his trade routes and his mortal life. But the memory lingered, half dream and half nightmare, worked into the wood grain of his tales until every trader who heard them carved a troll doll from driftwood, just in case. Those dolls still sell in Bergen gift shops today, ugly cute faces staring up from souvenir stands with expressions caught between menace and mirth. When night falls over, Hardanger Fjord and the northern lights paint the sky in shades of impossible green, the black water becomes a perfect mirror. And sometimes, if you know how to look, you can see faces reflected there that don't belong to anyone standing on the shore. In the hushed libraries of medieval Baghdad, scribes would pause their quills when copying tales of Sinbad's seventh voyage, lingering over descriptions of an island that wasn't quite an island at all. The sailor had mistaken the massive white dome for land itself until it cracked open, revealing not rock or coral, but the curved interior of an egg larger than any mosque. The mother that came for her offspring blotted out the sun with wings that stretched beyond the horizon, each feather catching starlight like silk thread spun from moonbeams. This wasn't mere sailor's fancy. 1,000 years later, when scholars compared these Arabic manuscripts with Marco Polo's careful notes from Madagascar, patterns emerged like constellations connecting across centuries. The Venetian explorer had written of enormous birds, the locals called rook, creatures so vast they could carry off elephants, their shed feathers used as water vessels by entire villages. He'd seen the bones himself, shipped north along trade routes that connected the Spice Islands to the perfumed courts of Persia. What neither Sinbad's scribes nor Marco Polo could have imagined was that they were documenting the ghostly afterimage of something real. In 1850, French naturalists working in Madagascar's red soil unearthed fossilized remains of Aepyornis, Maximus the elephant bird whose eggs measured 3 feet in circumference, and whose bones suggested a creature standing 11 feet tall. These very bones, it turned out, had been collected by Arab traders centuries earlier, shipped to Shiraz and Isfahan, where Persian scholars puzzled over their impossible proportions, weaving them into increasingly elaborate theories about the legendary simurgh. The simurgh, you see, was never just a bird in Persian tradition. Sufi poets like Attar used it as a mirror for the divine, a creature so pure it appeared only once every few centuries, nesting in the Kaf mountain that existed somewhere beyond the edge of all maps. In their mystical writings, the journey to find the simurgh became the soul's journey toward enlightenment. 30 birds setting out, only to discover they themselves were the simurgh they sought. The Arabic word simurgh literally means 30 birds, a riddle wrapped in feathers and starlight. These fossil bones, traded along silk roads and pondered in candlelit chambers, had given weight to dreams. They were proof that giants had once walked the earth, that the fantastic might have roots in forgotten soil. Medieval scholars, holding fragments of eggshell thicker than pottery, could almost hear the rustle of wings large enough to carry souls between earth and heaven. And so tonight, as caravans of stars cross the desert sky above sleeping dunes, the simurgh's secret remains safe in museum drawers and ancient text-part bird, part dream, part evidence that wonder sometimes leaves fossils behind for us to find. Centuries after the last great wings have folded into silence, the waters around Temasek have always held secrets beneath their surface, where moonlight catches on gentle swells and something ancient stirs in the depths. Tonight we drift to a place where legend meets the tide, where a prince once saw visions that would shape a nation's identity, and where modern eyes still catch glimpses of creatures that shouldn't exist. In the 13th century, according to the Malay annals, Sang Nila Utama stood upon these very shores when the impossible happened. The prince had been hunting on Bintan Island when a great storm drove his ship toward an unfamiliar coastline. As his vessel approached what would later be called Singapore, something magnificent breached the waves before him. A creature with the head of a lion and the body of a fish rose from the foam, its mane flowing like liquid gold in the tropical sun. The beast regarded the prince with ancient eyes before disappearing beneath the surface, leaving only ripples to mark its passage. This vision, this blessing from the sea itself, convinced Sang Nila Utama that he had found a place of power. He named it Singapura, the Lion's City, though no lions had ever walked these equatorial shores. The creature he had seen existed in that liminal space between myth and memory, between the possible and the profound. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, and by the 1970s Singapore had transformed into something unrecognizable from the prince's time. Concrete and steel reached toward the sky, and the old stories seemed quaint relics of a superstitious past. Yet something curious happened during these years of rapid modernization. The government commissioned a statue, a towering monument that would become the city's most recognizable symbol. They called it the Merlion, giving physical form to the prince's ancient vision. Half lion, half fish, it stood guard over Marina Bay, water flowing endlessly from its mouth, as if breathing life back into the old legends. What had once been a mystical encounter became a tourism icon, photographed millions of times by visitors who had no idea they were documenting something that had once been genuinely seen. But the waters remember what the land forgets. Even today, marine biologists report unusual sightings in these channels. Dugongs, those gentle sea cows, appear in Singapore's waters during certain tides, when phosphorescence lights the waves like scattered stars. Local fishermen speak quietly of shapes that move too gracefully to be ordinary sea life, forms that surface briefly in the pre-dawn hours when the harbour lights create an otherworldly glow. The lights still reflect across these gentle swells, casting dancing patterns that shift and shimmer like living things. In that interplay of illumination and darkness, past and present collapse into a single moment where a prince's vision feels as real as the concrete city rising behind us. Along the banks of the River Spey in the Scottish Highlands, where the water runs fast and deep through granite gorges, there lived a creature that the locals knew better than to trust. The Spey, you see, was notorious for claiming live travellers who ventured too close to its banks after dark, especially during the autumn months when the river swelled with highland rains. But the people of Speyside knew that not all of these drownings could be blamed on swift currents alone. The creature they called the Kelpie appeared most often as a magnificent black horse, standing knee-deep in the shallows where the river curved past the old droving roads. Its coat would gleam like polished obsidian in the moonlight, and its mane would flow like liquid shadow. But this was no ordinary horse, this was a predator that had perfected the art of deception over centuries. The Kelpie's hunting method was as elegant as it was deadly. It would position itself near river crossings, particularly where tired travelers might pause to water their own horses or wash the dust from their faces. The creature possessed an almost supernatural ability to read human nature. It could sense exhaustion, loneliness, the particular vulnerability that comes with being far from home as darkness falls. When such a traveler approached, the Kelpie would appear docile, even inviting, sometimes with what looked like a saddle already upon its back. Those who succumbed to the temptation to mount this convenient steed would find themselves in the creature's power. The moment human flesh touched the Kelpie's hide, it would become adhesive. There was no dismounting, no escape. The creature would then plunge into the deepest part of the river, carrying its victim down to the murky bottom where, according to local belief, it would consume everything but the liver, which would later wash ashore as the only evidence of what had transpired. The historical record supports these fears with grim statistics. The River Spey claimed an unusually high number of lives throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly among travelling merchants and drovers who moved cattle between highland markets. The swift current and unpredictable depth certainly accounted for many of these deaths, but the pattern troubled local communities. Too many experienced horsemen, too many who knew the river well, were being found drowned in circumstances that defied easy explanation. These Kelpie stories served a vital social function, acting as cautionary parables that kept people away from the river's most dangerous stretches after dark. Parents would tell their children about the beautiful black horse that meant death, and wise travelers would make their river crossings during daylight hours, never alone. On quiet highland evenings, when the mist rose from the Spey like ghostly fingers, locals claimed you could sometimes hear harp music drifting from the windows of the old blacksmith shops, a ethereal melody that seemed to calm the cattle and horses, as if the ancient music held some power to ward off the water horse's hunger. The fire crackles low now, orange light dancing across weathered faces as another log settles into glowing coals. Out here in the Oregon wilderness, where the Cascade Pass cuts through ancient mountains, the night feels thick with possibility. Somewhere in the darkness beyond our circle of warmth, coyotes call to each other across the valleys, their voices echoing off granite walls that have stood since the world was young. It was in the 1930s when Douglas Herrick, a taxidermist from Wyoming, created what would become one of America's most enduring cryptid legends. But this wasn't born from ancient folklore or whispered campfire tales. This was pure roadside Americana, a bit of Depression-era whimsy that got completely out of hand. Herrick had been commissioned to mount a jackrabbit that a local hunter had brought in, nothing unusual there. But sitting nearby was a pair of deer antlers, and something about the way the afternoon light hit them both gave Douglas an idea that would echo through decades. He carefully grafted those antlers onto the rabbit's skull, creating the first jackalope. It was meant as a joke, really, something to get a laugh from the locals who frequented his shop. But the creature he'd created had an undeniable charm, this impossible hybrid of the American West's most common animals. Word spread quickly through the small Wyoming town, and soon people were driving from neighboring counties just to see the rabbit with antlers. The jackalope's fame exploded when postcards started appearing in truck stops and diners across the Mountain West. These weren't just novelty items, they were presented as genuine documentation of a species that roamed the high desert. Waitresses would slip them to curious travelers with knowing winks, spinning tales of herds of jackalopes bounding across sagebrush plains under full moons. The postcards multiplied like, well, rabbits, spreading the myth from diner to diner along America's growing highway system. What made the jackalope legend so convincing was an unexpected kernel of scientific truth. The Shope papillomavirus, discovered around the same time, actually causes horn-like growths on wild rabbits. These keratinous tumors can look remarkably similar to small antlers, especially when glimpsed in poor light or at a distance. Nature had been creating proto-jackalopes all along, providing just enough real-world evidence to make the hoax seem plausible. The embers shift and spark, sending tiny stars up into the mountain air where they wink out among the real constellations. A great horned owl calls somewhere in the pine darkness, and for just a moment, in this place where reality feels thin as mountain air, you might almost believe that something with antlers and powerful hind legs could come bounding through the firelight, pausing just long enough to tip its rack before disappearing back into the American mythology from which it came. Deep in the heart of Bavaria, where the Alps cast long shadows and ancient forests whisper secrets older than memory, there lived a creature that belonged neither to earth nor sky, neither to dream nor waking life. The Wolpertinger, they called Eta beast so peculiar that even the German language seemed to struggle with its existence, as if words themselves were unsure whether to take it seriously. Picture, if you will, the warmest corner of a Bavarian tavern on a winter evening in 1847. The fire crackles, casting dancing, shadows on weathered faces, and the air thick with pipe smoke and the scent of roasted meat. Old Heinrich, the village's most notorious spinner of tales, leans forward with eyes twinkling with mischief. "You want to know about the Wolpertinger?" he whispers, his voice carrying just enough gravity to make the younger men lean in. Well, imagine a rabbit, but not just any rabbit. This one sprouted antlers like a proud stag, wings like a barn owl, and tusks that would make a wild boar envious. The tavern erupts in laughter, but Heinrich's expression remains perfectly serious. Mock if you will, but my grandfather's cousin's nephew saw one just last Tuesday. And so the legend grows, fed by beer and embellished with each telling, until even the skeptics begin to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, there might be something lurking in those misty forests after all. But here's where the story takes a curious turn towards something resembling truth. Those same forests that inspired Heinrich's tales were indeed home to genuine mysteries. On moonless nights, when fog rolled through the valleys like ghostly fingers, hunters and woodsmen reported strange silhouettes moving between the trees. What they saw, in that peculiar twilight world where reality blurs at the edges, were likely nothing more than rabbits pausing beneath low branches where owls had settled for the night. The owl's wings spread wide for balance, the rabbit's ears erect with alertness from a distance. Through shifting mist and uncertain light, the two creatures might indeed appear as one impossible beast. Nature, it seems, has always been the most talented creator of myths, requiring only darkness, distance, and a human imagination willing to fill in the gaps with wonder. Fast forward to our modern age, where the Wolpertinger has transformed from tavern tale to tourist attraction. Visitors to Bavaria can purchase official hunting licenses for these elusive creatures, complete with instructions to carry salt in their pockets, supposedly the only substance capable of stunning a Wolpertinger long enough for capture. Tour guides lead expeditions into the very forests where those original sightings occurred, their voices carrying the same playful authority as old Heinrich's. The salt, they explain with theatrical seriousness, must be blessed by a Bavarian priest and carried in your left pocket while hopping on one foot under a full moon. As evening settles over the Franconian valleys and church bells begin their ancient song, drifting across meadows shrouded in perpetual mist, one cannot help but wonder, in a world that grows smaller and more explained with each passing day, perhaps we need our Wolpertingers more than ever. In the red heart of Arnhem Land, where the air shimmers with ancient heat and the rocks hold secrets older than civilization, there exists a presence that has wound its way through Aboriginal consciousness for millennia, the rainbow serpent Inga Liod, to the Kunwinjiku peoples, not merely myth but living geography, a creature whose very breath carved the waterways that snake across Australia's northern territories. Picture, if you will, the dreaming time, that eternal now, when ancestral spirits walked the earth in physical form. The rainbow serpent moved like liquid light across an empty landscape, her massive coils pressing into soft earth, creating the riverbeds that would carry life-giving water for countless generations. Each curve of the Alligator River, each bend in the East Alligator River system, marks where she chose to rest, to turn, to continue her eternal journey. These are not random geographical features, but deliberate pathway songlines made manifest in stone and water. The Kunwinje Ku elders speak of her scales catching sunlight after the wet season rains, creating the rainbow arcs that bridge earth and sky. She is both creator and destroyer, bringing the monsoons that flood the floodplains and the devastating cyclones that reshape the coastline. Her moods determine whether the year brings abundance or drought, whether the barramundi run thick in the rivers or the waterholes dry to cracked mud. What makes this creature's story remarkable is not just its spiritual significance, but its archaeological persistence. Deep in the rock galleries of Uber and Nurlungi, ochre paintings stretch back 8,000 years, an unbroken artistic chronicle that spans more centuries than most civilizations have existed. These aren't primitive scratches on stone, but sophisticated artistic traditions, showing the rainbow serpent in dozens of forms. Sometimes as a massive python with human features, sometimes as a crocodile with a serpent's tail, always with the distinctive cross-hatched pattern that Aboriginal artists call raak. Carbon dating of the pigments reveals layers upon layers of artistic revision, each generation of artists painting over their ancestors' work, maintaining the stories while adding their own interpretations. The oldest depictions show a more abstract serpent, geometric and stylized. As millennia passed, The artwork became more naturalistic, more detailed, suggesting not the evolution of artistic skill but the refinement of a continuous cultural memory. Modern hydrologists have discovered something remarkable about the serpent's sacred sites. Every major rainbow serpent location in Arnhem Land sits directly above natural springs or underground aquifers. The spots where Aboriginal people have maintained ceremonial grounds for thousands of years correspond precisely with geological surveys showing underground water sources. The serpent's path through the landscape follows the actual underground flow of water through the ancient rock formations. This isn't coincidence, but indigenous knowledge, encoded in spiritual narrativa way of preserving crucial survival information about water sources across countless generations without written language. The rainbow serpent sites serve as a living map of the region's hydrology, disguised as religious practice but functioning as practical geography. In the vast silence of the outback night, under stars that seem close enough to pluck from the darkness, the presence of the rainbow serpent feels less like mythology and more like memory, the earth itself, remembering the forces that shaped it, breathing softly through the stories of those who learned to listen. In the archipelago of Kilauea, where wooden houses perch on stilts like patient herons waiting for the tide, there once lived a creature that blurred the line between sea and myth. The waters here run deep and cold, fed by currents that have traveled from Antarctica, carrying with them stories older than the Mapuche settlements that dot these remote shores. The Camahueto was no ordinary beast. Picture, if you will, a calf born of ocean foam and moonlight sleek as a seal, yet possessing the gentle eyes of cattle that graze in highland meadows. From its forehead sprouted a single horn, not twisted like the narwhal's tusk, but smooth and pearl white, catching starlight even in the deepest waters. Its mane flowed silver white, streaming behind it like captured sea mist as it raced through the channels between islands. When the Camahueto chose to journey inland, following the rivers that snake through Chiloé's emerald interior, something magical happened. The water in its wake would shimmer and dance, as if scattered with crushed diamonds. Fishermen returning at dusk would find their familiar waterways transformed into glittering highways, the surface alive with an otherworldly luminescence that seemed to pulse with each movement of the mysterious creature below. The Mapuche healers understood the Camahueto's true gift. They would wait patiently by certain riverbanks during the new moon, when the creature was said to shed tiny shavings from its magnificent horn. These fragments, no larger than a child's fingernail, were more precious than any treasure chest buried by Spanish conquistadors. Ground into fine powder and mixed with spring water, they formed remedies that could heal everything from broken bones to broken hearts. A single pinch could ease a fever that had raged for days. A careful measure could mend wounds that refused to close. Most remarkably, these horn shavings could restore hope to those who had lost their way in life's darker passages, though perhaps that healing power came as much from the act of believing in magic as from the horn itself. As centuries passed, the Camahueto sightings grew rare, though never quite disappeared entirely. Modern observers began to notice something curious. The creature's appearances often coincided with the southern right whale migrations. These magnificent cetaceans, scarred white from battles with orcas and barnacle attachments, would surface in Kilauea's waters like living islands. Could generations of coastal dwellers have glimpsed these whalebacks breaking the surface in the pre-dawn darkness, their pale scars catching the first hints of sunlight, and transformed the sight into something even more wondrous? Even now, when evening mist settles over those wooden stilt houses like a gentle blanket, locals sometimes pause in their daily routines. They listen for the soft splash of something large moving through the channels, watch for that telltale glitter spreading across water that should be dark and still. Because in places where the ocean meets the imagination, the Camahueto might just be waiting for the right moment to race upriver once again, leaving a trail of silver light in its wake. The year is 1921, and somewhere high in the throat of the world, where oxygen grows thin and thoughts move like honey, a British mountaineer named George Mallory crouches in the snow. The Everest reconnaissance expedition has brought him here to Lac Pala, this wind-swept col that guards the approaches to the mountain they're not yet ready to climb. Evening light slants golden across the Tibetan plateau, painting the snowfields in shades of amber and rose, And in this crystalline silence, Mallory notices something that will puzzle cryptozoologists for decades to come. There, pressed into the virgin snow like prehistoric calling cards, are footprints, not the neat, crampon-marked impressions of his fellow climbers, nor the delicate tracks of the blue sheep that sometimes venture to these heights. These are something else entirely. Large, humanoid impressions, stretching in a purposeful line across the col, each one measuring nearly twice the length of Mallory's own boots. He pulls out his camera, that bulky apparatus of brass and leather, and begins documenting what he sees. Click. The shutter captures shadows pooled in heel strikes. Click. Another frame preserves the mysterious spacing, the curious gait that seems both familiar and utterly alien. Mallory, ever the methodical climber, produces his measuring tape. 13 inches long, these tracks, and nearly 6 inches wide at their broadest point. The depth suggests significant weight, yet the edges remain surprisingly clean, as if whatever made them possessed an uncanny lightness of foot despite its apparent bulk. He sketches notes in his expedition journal, his pencil scratching against paper in the thin air while his breath forms small clouds that dissipate into the darkening sky. The photographs he takes will later become some of the most famous cryptozoological evidence in history, reproduced in countless books and documentaries, analyzed frame by believers and skeptics alike. But here's where our sleepy story takes a turn toward the prosaic, as the best monster tales often do. Those mysterious tracks, photographed with such care by Mallory on that crystalline evening, were almost certainly made by a Himalayan brown bear. These remarkable creatures, Ursus arctos isabelinus, have a peculiar winter walking pattern when moving through deep snow. They step in a near straight line, placing their hind paws directly into the impressions left by their front paws, creating what appears to be a bipedal gait. The resulting tracks, elongated by partial melting and refreezing, can easily measure 13 inches or more, especially when photographed at the dramatic angles that mountain photography demands. As twilight deepens over Lac Pilar, and the wind begins its nightly whisper through the prayer flags strung between stone cairns, we can imagine Mallory packing away his camera, unaware that he's just documented one of mountaineering's most enduring mysteries. Somewhere in the distance, yak bells chime their bronze lullaby, and a Tibetan herder murmurs prayers over mani stones worn smooth by countless pilgrims' fingers. The truth about those tracks matters less, perhaps, than the wonder they inspire, the way they remind us that in places where the earth scrapes the sky, magic still feels possible, even when science provides simpler explanations. Deep in the shadow-draped valleys of the Vindhya Mountains, where ancient stones remember older gods, there lived stories that blurred the line between serpent and soul. Here, beneath canopies of sal and teak, the Nagas were more than myth, they were family, lovers, the very breath of the sacred groves that dotted these timeless hills. The Puranas speak of marriages that would make modern minds pause and wonder. Princess Ulupi, daughter of the serpent king Kauravya, rose from the Ganges to claim Arjuna as her husband for a single moonlit night. But these weren't isolated tales spun from imagination's thread. Village after village carried memories of brides who disappeared into temple pools at dawn, leaving only the scent of jasmine and the soft hiss of disturbed water. By the 1800s, British administrators filing their meticulous reports from remote outposts began documenting ceremonies that defied their ordered world. District collectors wrote of wedding processions that ended not at decorated mandaps, but at ancient stepwells where families offered their daughters to the coiled darkness below. These weren't primitive superstitions, the more thoughtful observers noted, but elaborate rituals steeped in theological complexity that stretched back millennia. At the old Shiva temples scattered throughout the region, the massive stone water tanks became theaters for the impossible. Families would arrive before dawn, carrying brass vessels of milk and honey, while temple priests prepared the sacred space with geometric patterns of rice flour. Then, as if summoned by invisible currents, the king cobras would emerge not aggressive, but strangely docile, their movements synchronized with chanted mantras that seemed to pull them from whatever realm they normally inhabited. The cobras would circle the offered bride 3 times. Their hoods flared in what witnesses swore resembled blessing rather than threat. Some brides would weep, others stood transfixed, but all submitted to a ceremony that colonial observers struggled to categorize in their neat administrative files. Through it all, the air grew thick with sandalwood smoke that spiraled lazily upward, carrying prayers older than memory. Bamboo flutes played melodies that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves, haunting, repetitive phrases that lulled both serpent and human into something approaching trance. The music would continue long after the ceremonies ended, echoing off ancient walls until listeners couldn't tell where sound ended and dream began. Even today, in villages where electricity flickers and old stones still hold their secrets, they say the flute notes continue, calling across centuries to anyone willing to listen to the whispered promises between worlds. In the pewter waters off Iceland's coast, where the North Atlantic meets ancient volcanic shores, there exists a phenomenon that has puzzled mariners for generations. They call it sea mist, though it behaves unlike any fog you've ever encountered. It rises from the depths in perfect circles, sometimes spanning hundreds of meters, creating what appears to be a massive, breathing presence just beneath the surface. The Old Norse spoke of the Hafgufa, a creature so vast that sailors would mistake its back for an island. Medieval texts described jaws that could swallow entire schools of fish, creating whirlpools that would drag unwary vessels into the abyss. But the Icelandic fishermen of the 18th and 19th centuries told a different story, one that emerged from their careful observations during the long summer nights when darkness never fully claimed the northern seas. Captain Björn Eriksson, writing in his log in 1847, described what he witnessed during a herring run near the Westman Islands. The water began to churn in a perfect circle, perhaps 200 paces across, he wrote in his careful script. Then came the mist, rising like the breath of some sleeping giant. But strangest of all were the sounds so low rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself, followed by what I can only describe as the closing of enormous jaws. Other sailors reported similar encounters. The sea would suddenly come alive with silver flashes as thousands of herring moved in frantic, spiraling patterns. Then the circle of disturbed water would appear, followed by that distinctive mist, and finally, the sound that chilled them moss to wet, thunderous closing, as if the ocean itself had taken a bite. What these men were witnessing was one of nature's most sophisticated feeding strategies, though they couldn't have known it at the time. The sea mist was actually the exhalation of fin whales employing a technique called lunge feeding. These massive creatures, second only to blue whales in size, would dive deep beneath schools of herring, then rise with their mouths agape, taking in enormous volumes of water and fish. The mist was simply their breath condensing in the cool Arctic air as they expelled the water through their baleen plates, keeping only the fish. The circular disturbance patterns were created by the whales' coordinated movements as they herded their prey, sometimes working in pairs to create walls of bubbles that confused and concentrated the herring. The upwelling of nutrient-rich water from the deep ocean had triggered massive plankton blooms, which in turn attracted the herring in numbers so vast they darkened the water. As the evening settles over these northern waters, lanterns begin to sway gently on the decks of fishing vessels, casting dancing shadows that merge with the natural twilight. Crews gather in small groups, their voices dropping to whispers as they share tales passed down through generations. They speak of the Hafgufa not as a monster to be feared, but as a presence to be respected, reminder that beneath the surface of their familiar seas, ancient rhythms continue, unchanged since the world was young. The year was 1975, and the waters around Falmouth Harbour held secrets that would soon spill into the flickering blue light of television screens across Britain. A local photographer, whose name has drifted into the mists of time like so many Cornwall stories, captured something moving through Mounts Bay that shouldn't have been there. The photographs were grainy, as all the best monster photos are, showing a dark serpentine form cutting through the gentle swells where fishing boats had worked for centuries. The BBC took notice, as they did in those days when the world moved more slowly and mysteries had room to breathe. Television crews descended on the Cornish coast, their equipment cases bumping along cobblestone streets that had watched smugglers and saints pass by in equal measure. The creature they sought bore the ancient name Morgar, meaning sea giant in the old Cornish tongue, though locals simply called it the thing in the bay. But the sea keeps its own counsel, and what washes ashore often tells stories different from what we imagine lurking beneath. Marine biologists, summoned by the growing attention, examined the photographs with the patient skepticism of those who spend their lives studying the ocean's honest mysteries. They spoke of basking sharks, those gentle giants that grow to lengths that would dwarf most boats, and how death transforms even the familiar into something otherworldly. A basking shark's corpse, they explained to anyone who would listen, follows predictable patterns as it surrenders to decay. The great dorsal fin, so distinctive in life, softens and falls away first. The massive jaw structure, designed for filtering tiny creatures from vast volumes of water, collapses and distorts. What remains can drift for weeks, the decomposing cartilaginous spine creating undulations that move with the current like a serpent swimming through dreams. The photographers had likely captured one of these ancient mariners in its final journey, though this explanation seemed almost cruel in its efficiency, reducing wonder to mere biology. Yet there's something beautiful in this too. The way death and time and tide can transform a known creature into something that stirs the same primitive awe our ancestors felt when they first watched storm clouds gather on the horizon. As evening settles over Mounts Bay now, decades after those photographs sparked their brief fire of curiosity, the water moves with the same eternal rhythm. Somewhere in the distance, perhaps from the church of St. Michael on its rocky mount, comes the sound of evening hymns drifting across the water. Voices lift in ancient melodies while the surf whispers its endless lullaby against granite cliffs worn smooth by millennia of patient attention. The Morgar may have been nothing more than a decomposing basking shark, or perhaps something else entirely. The bay keeps both possibilities cradled in its depths, along with all the other stories that have played out on these waters since the legendary land of Lyonesse slipped beneath the waves, taking its bells and towers and dreams down into the darkness where mystery lives on, undisturbed by explanation.